Yeah, the first time I met Nigel Farage, I was chatting to him and one of his social media content managers, and we were discussing this particular issue. And what I said to them at the time was that I don't think people should presume or assume that the tax incentives and the government structures and the government promises will continue to be there. So in the UK, it's the issue of ISAs and the SIPs, and then in Australia, it's the superannuation. There was the story of Gordon Brown with the pensions, the corporate pensions going bust like Carillion. Because we're aware of a few different jurisdictions, we know that this is quite common, that governments sort of create these systems that are tax efficient or beneficial in some way, and then they get reformed after you've committed to this system. And I think not trusting that those beneficial tax rules or those structures will continue to be there all the way through your retirement is a key part of it. So the solution to that would be...
Welcome to the Exponential Investor Podcast. Want to be a better, smarter, more clued up investor? Well, you've come to the right place. We cover the breakthrough investment ideas you don't hear about in the mainstream to keep you on top of the megatrends and opportunities reshaping our world.
Good morning and welcome to another episode of the Exponential Investor Podcast. I am your editor, Sam Volkering, and as mentioned last week, our regular co-editor, Kit Winder, isn't with us. He's away on leave, so I've rung in a friend and colleague, Nick Hubble from Fortune and Freedom, to have a chat with me today about some pretty interesting stuff, I think, and we'll dive right in. So thanks for jumping on with us today, Nick. I hope you've been well. Where are you at the moment? Are you still in Japan, are you?
That's right, I'm still in Japan, waiting on the second baby. But where's Kit? Does anyone know where he is?
It's like, where in the world is Carmen Sandiego? Where in the world is Kit Winder? Anyway, let's dive in today, Nick, because I love catching up with you and having some robust discussions about everything that's going on in the world, because we share similar views on some things, but then sometimes we have completely diametric opposing views about things. So I always love bringing you in and having a chat about the world. I want to sort of start at the top and look at the big idea of financial repression, because there's a lot going on in the world. I know this is an area of a topic of interest that you cover immensely and with great detail. There's so much happening in the world with restrictions and government and centralized authority telling us what we can and what we can't do. I want to kind of hone in on that idea and I guess get your view on where you see the British market in particular in relation to all these changing views around restrictions, social restrictions, financial manipulations. I mean, what's an investor to make of completely getting bombarded with negative information? It's enough to put the fear of God into anyone. How do you navigate the markets? How do you invest in a time where everything is just so, as a term that the Fed likes to use, so transitory?
Yeah, well, if I was going to be optimistic, I'd start talking about cryptocurrencies, which is your area of expertise. But mine is about what's going to go wrong and what all these governments are going to be doing to people that makes them need to own at least some cryptocurrencies in their portfolio. I hate that word, portfolio, but somewhere in their wealth to have these assets, these investments that governments cannot control, certainly not as easily as the typical financial assets that most people hold for their retirement. I personally advocate gold as well, as you know, but the cryptocurrency world, as far as I'm concerned anyway, exists because of the fact that the government can't strangle it in the same ways. To me, that's why cryptocurrencies were created and why the demand is there for them. But my focus still is very much on why and how governments are going to crack down on all sorts of different parts of our financial lives, and not just the rest of our lives as they have been for the past 2 years. And I think it's really important that people realize that that's not unusual. In fact, it's the norm. The sort of things that the financial repression is about, the sort of things that capital controls are about, that is the normal state of the world, a world where governments really heavy-handedly control our financial lives, especially across borders. But people need to realize that this temporary period of free capital flows and floating exchanges and all this sort of thing, that might be coming to an end, and the financial world that we've known and grown comfortable with, and upon which a lot of our assumptions are based when we invest, could be about to change.
Yeah, I think that idea of our assumptions and what we know about finance, I think, is certainly in the midst of a significant change. And I think you're right. There's certain, this idea of controls. Well, from my view, it seems like it changes with every time we have a changeover of leadership or government, because everybody's trying to bring the popular policy of the day into line of fire, which just seems to be that appeases, I guess, the woke crowd, I suppose, is something that seems to be thrown around a lot in politics. When it comes to government overreach and meddling in the system, we both have seen how that plays out with the superannuation system in Australia. So for anyone that doesn't know, that's the pension system in Australia. That's what they call it, superannuation. Well, I mean, what's a retiree to do? You've got a bit of money tucked away that you've been diligently trying to invest and build and save over time. Yet you've got the fear of the heavy hand of government reaching over your shoulder, looking to try and find a way to tax it or wrestle it back away from you. Certainly, I think, as you mentioned, cryptocurrencies is, I think, a part solution to that problem. But at the same time, there's an element of risk of being too heavily invested in cryptocurrency. So, I mean, what are your thoughts around that? What are some of the mechanisms that people can think about or should be thinking about in order to protect themselves, I suppose?
Yeah, the first time I met Nigel Farage, I was chatting to him and one of his social media content managers, and we were discussing this particular issue. And what I said to them at the time was that I don't think people should presume or assume that the tax incentives and the government structures and the government promises will continue to be there. So in the UK, it's the issue of ISAs and the SIPs, and then in Australia, it's the superannuation. There was the story of Gordon Brown with the pensions, the corporate pensions going bust like Carillion. Because we're aware of a few different jurisdictions, we know that this is quite common, that governments sort of create these systems that are tax efficient or beneficial in some way, and then they get reformed after you've committed to this system. And I think not trusting that those beneficial tax rules or those structures will continue to be there all the way through your retirement is a key part of it. So the solution to that would be to diversify. So don't rely entirely on money being in your ISA, don't rely entirely on your SIP, don't rely entirely on all these different things. I get irritated when people say you should diversify, because often diversification is a way to generate mediocre returns. If you own everything, then you also own the duds as well as the things that are doing especially well. And that's wise, but I think it can get taken too far. But in this case, diversification, not just within the stock market, not just within asset classes, but also, for example, where you hold them, the locations, whether you have them inside your ISA or outside your ISA, inside your SIPs or outside. All of these sorts of things that the government can adjust and twist they will be adjusted and twisted. I feel like for years I've been trying to think of the analogy or the metaphor that is commonly used for this situation, but I can't quite remember it. It's the opposite of closing the door, or closing the gate once the horse is bolted. It's closing the gate once the horse is gone into the pen, thinking that they can escape whenever they want. And then, or it's that haunted house moment when you walk into the haunted house and the door slams shut behind you and you can't open it anymore. I think investors need to be really wary about that moment when their assets are committed to a particular structure that's used to be very tax incentivized and efficient, and all of a sudden, the government declares, well, actually, we're going to means test this, or actually, we're going to tax this at a higher rate because only rich people do it, or whatever the change might be. People need to realize that's coming. And so I think having a lot of your wealth outside of those weird and wonderful systems is a good thing to do, so that, the government's not going to make sweeping changes to everything at once. It's going to target the parts of the financial system where they've created incentives, beneficial tax incentives or whatever it might be.
The idea of how you hold your investments and assets, I don't think people think enough about that. That very idea. It reminds me of this story. I can't remember the guy's name, but he's back, I think it was pre-17's crypto sort of boom and then sort of crypto winter. And we've obviously since gone on to greater highs from there. But he had he talks about how he stores and has stored a whole bunch of Bitcoin on hardware devices all over the world. So he says on 5 different continents, he holds Bitcoin in a hardware device in a location that, you know, only he and only, I think, his kids know about. And I found that interesting because it kind of like the ability to do that isn't necessarily that easy, right? So it's not easy to go and hold money in different countries in different accounts or different structures. It's certainly with the traditional financial system, it's certainly not cost effective for the average person. But then when we do talk about something like cryptocurrencies, and look, when we talk about financial repression and breaking free from financial repression, the conversation does inevitably keep coming back to crypto, because that's really what it is by design, is that moving outside of a system that for so long has been manipulated and corrupted and built into this incredibly complex and convoluted system that doesn't really actually work for everybody. And so
I just want to make an example of that playing out really clear to people that I should have experienced. So over the last 5 years or so, I've lived in 6 or 7 different countries. I've moved around all the time, been a taxpayer in all sorts of places, and I've actually lived in those places and worked in those places, not just visited them. And each time it was an absolute bureaucratic and tax world like spectacular nightmare of epic proportions, and it still is. It still is dealing with all of those. And I spend a huge amount of my time trying to get the upgrades to banking apps for bank accounts and trying to deal with customer services in various places and needing local phone numbers and not having them. In fact, at the moment, I've got no phone number because I haven't bothered to get one here in Japan. And it's a total nightmare to deal with the financial system if you're moving around. If my wealth was denominated in Bitcoin during all this process, it wouldn't have made any significant difference to having to deal with all these financial institutions. It would have been me and the Bitcoin. And each time I moving my wealth with me would have been significantly easier with no sort of, I guess, transaction costs of bringing my wealth around in my currencies. And I think the growth of the whole digital nomad movement is going to be a huge part of Bitcoin's demand. And I think that movement's only going to grow as this issue of financial repression grows, because more and more people are going to need to get out of wherever it is they are to avoid these sorts of crackdowns.
That's interesting. I don't think that idea around digital nomads, I don't think that's probably explored in enough detail by most people. It's because, like you say, like a lot of people don't actually experience what it is like to have to move countries and then have to move your entire financial life as well. I remember when I moved from Australia to the UK, the issue was, you'd try and find somewhere to rent so that you could live somewhere when you first moved over here. And the problem was that you couldn't rent somewhere unless you had a bank account, but you couldn't get a bank account unless you had an address. And you couldn't get either of those unless you had, a telephone account, or you had some bills and utilities to prove your address and to prove you could earn money and all these things. So it's you sort of the snake trying to catch snake biting its tail. You just keep going around in these vicious circles where you can't actually get anything done, and it is an absolute nightmare to do. And I've got one of these here, and for people listening in and not watching, this probably isn't necessarily going to be the greatest example, but if you're watching, I'm this little device that I've just pulled out from behind me is a Ledger hardware wallet. I could carry my entire wealth in cryptocurrency on this little device, jam it in my pocket, and go anywhere in the world and bring it with me. The minute I land there, it's as accessible that it is to me then as it is to me now. That, I think, that's a change in how we can actually move wealth around the world that really has never existed before Bitcoin. That ability to be nomadic and mobile. And with And I'm actually also interested, and this sort of does bring us to another topic around the idea of digital nomads, or is work from home and remote working. If this becomes our new normal, and I want to get your idea on whether or not it is going to be our new normal or not, then all of a sudden you're right. The idea of cryptocurrency and Bitcoin and the ability to move borders or get paid in Bitcoin from one place to another. You might be living in Germany, Japan, the UK, but the company you're working for might be based in Estonia or Singapore or wherever. It doesn't really matter, and you could be getting paid in Bitcoin. And this happens a lot, or another cryptocurrency. In terms of the bigger trend, is this something? Do you think that this is what we will see? Is that more and more and more there will be companies without head offices? Is that we will be working from home, or there will be digital nomads that will be working from all over the place? It's not an idea that's new. We've been talking about micro work and these sorts of things for a long time, but certainly it seems like with cryptocurrency, it helps to, I guess, grease the wheels for that system to come to fruition.
Yeah, it's what I should have done. I regret not doing it. I regret not doing exactly what you've just said, making my financial life flow first and foremost through cryptocurrencies, which have made my life a hell of a lot easier over the last 5 years. But the more interesting angle here for our subscribers is think about the digital nomad movement as a retirement thing, right? Because if financial repression and capital controls are coming in, and you've got the opportunity to evade them by becoming
we don't,
a
by the
digital
way,
nomad,
advocate evading any taxes or anything.
Well, by becoming a digital nomad,
just want to clarify that.
So literally physically evading the nation states. Not the taxes of each different place if you actually live there. But this becomes viable now. You can move your wealth, to a new country every 6 months and keep moving around, seeing the world. And because of the cost of living differences, that I think that whole world becomes viable. A digital nomad retiree who just keeps moving. The obvious way of organizing your financial life, if you want to do that, is cryptocurrencies. It's certainly not the legacy financial system. And I think that might be the next big boom, because these people have not just income sources, they've got assets, and then they're drawing down those assets to enjoy life. So this is the obvious thing to do.
Do you know what this reminds me of somewhat of a conversation I had with our colleague Boaz Shoshan not too long ago about yachts. In terms of, we sort of started talking about this idea, and that you could pick up stumps and effectively move your domicile, your residency, your tax residency, all those sorts of things to a more friendly tax environment. Take all your wealth with you and be treated in a much more tax effective way. And it made me think, and it's an idea that I've coined with for some time. That maybe if I become a digital nomad in the far off future, retiree in the far off future, that you'd consider just buying a yacht, living on a yacht, and moving out into international waters every 6 months, and just being somewhere where, I'm not sure what the tax treatment is on international waters, but I'm sure it's a damn sight better than the UK or Australia or Japan for that matter. And in that sense, I'm like, well, maybe we should be long on yacht manufacturers. I know during the pandemic, I saw an interesting article about the rise in sales in super and mega yachts absolutely went through the roof during the pandemic, which I don't know whether that's a reflection of the widening rich-poor divide, or whether it's just a reflection of people wanting to get on yachts and get the hell out of Dodge. But it makes me think that maybe some of these regions that are more tax friendly and tax effective, trying to attract people that have got wealth and money to move there and be looked after in a better way. Maybe these are some of the places that investors should be thinking about. And if there's a publicly listed mega yacht company out there, maybe it's worth running the ruler over that as well.
I think the part of this that people should focus on is that the alternative is becoming consistent, or going to become consistently less attractive, in the sense that there will be capital controls and financial repression. For example, the real return on bonds, which is a big part of people's portfolio and their retirement plans. It's a negative yield, you're losing your wealth. And so the alternative becomes more and more attractive. And I think more of that is going to happen in various different ways, especially capital controls. So I think it's not just the attraction of the digital nomad lifestyle, especially for retirees. It's also the pressure that's being put on people who can't move or don't move. It's also worth pointing out, of course, that the company that is publishing this was initially founded as a magazine for not quite digital nomads, but international living was basically about people retiring overseas, looking for better places to go to, and a big part of that was taxes. So we've come full circle.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, to be fair, I'm sure we could keep going on about this for quite some time, looking into things like utilizing some of the newer facets of decentralized finance and generating, high interest with some of the new crypto high interest accounts. There are some that are doing 9, 10, 12% on stable coins, which not only beats inflation, but it beats some most investment returns at the moment as well. That's a whole nother topic that we could maybe dive into another time and continue this discussion. But we have gone on for long enough today. We like to keep Exponential Investor podcast nice and short and sharp for you. Key takeaway today, buy a yacht and nick off into international waters, I think is the one thing is we should all do. Anyway, thanks, Nick, so much for joining us. Appreciate your time. Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening. We'll be back with you again next week. I think Kit's still away, so I'll either ring in Nick again or get another guest in to have a chat with us. But thanks for tuning in, and we'll be with you again soon. Bye for now.